This lecture is going to focus both on 3.6 and 3.7, both of which are the French Revolution, and we're going to try and do them kind of rolled into one. So here's the objectives here. By the end of your reading and this lecture, you should be able to do the things that these objectives ask for. So if you need to go back and review, these are going to be a good source for that. So here's some of the vocabulary. Some of the ones that I really want you to focus on: the ancien regime here, the estates. This one is super important, the bourgeoisie. This is like the top of the middle class. I always tell students, think of the bougie, bourgeoisie, super fancy, super rich, and then we'll explain what the tennis court oath is, but you need to know this one as well. For vocabulary from 3.7, focus on these two and know what they are. They're going to be the radicals who take control of the government and eliminate the monarchy. And then this is probably one of the most important things from the entire unit, which is nationalism. This is going to come into play in topic 5 when pretty much our whole topic is just nationalism. So make sure you understand it by the end of this topic here. So two of our most important people of the French Revolution are going to be Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI. They're going to be the king and queen of France, and you can see they live a hugely extravagant lifestyle, which is going to play into the reasons why a lot of the French people want to rebel against them. This video is a perfect review of the French Revolution. It basically follows everything we're going to go over all the way from 3.6 to 3.8. I would highly suggest watching it if you're confused. So the causes of the French Revolution are going to be extremely varied, but the French government had many of the same issues that the British government had before the American Revolution. The biggest one being that they're in even worse debt than the British government. They had been fighting the 7 Years' War as well as funding the American Revolution, and the monarchy had an extremely expensive lifestyle. The monarchy would spend what a whole region in France would tax for a year on just one party. So they're just going more and more and more into debt. The Palace of Versailles is a huge, like, sprawling complex. It's not just a palace. It's like acres and acres of buildings. It's very expensive upkeep. And there's a bad harvest. So now, not only is the monarchy spending more than it can bring in, there's debt from wars, the peasants don't have any food, and they're continuing to be taxed. They also had a very outdated social system. So the French social system was called the estates, and every person could be broken up into one of these 3 classes. So the first estate was the clergy, and this is just the Catholic Church, who owned 10% of the land of all of France, but they paid no taxes, none at all. The second estate was the nobility, who owned a lot of land, but had little income, so they paid no taxes. And finally, there was the third estate, and this is everyone else. It was the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class. Think of the bourgeoisie as like the very top of the middle class, all the way down to peasants. So it's a super diverse class, and they paid the taxes. So if you look at this chart over here, you can see that the clergy and the nobility make up 2% of the population, and the third estate is everyone else. And we're going to find out this is a major issue for voting for France whenever they have to vote on anything. You should know how to make this pyramid and explain what each of these estates are. So because of all the issues that are facing France, and they can't get their debt under control, they can't get their government to work correctly, the King of France calls this thing called the Estates General. And think of it as like the French Congress. You can see in this photo here, this is the nobility over here, the clergy, and then the third estate here is meeting. And they all meet together to try and figure out France's issues. The problem was the first and second estate always combined and outvoted the third estate. This is because the third estate wants everybody else to pay taxes. The first and second estate don't pay taxes, so they would naturally work together. The way that the first and second estate could always make it work, that they get what they want, is the traditional method of voting in France was each estate got 1 vote. So the clergy got 1 vote, nobility got 1 vote, and the third estate got 1 vote. So first, second, and third estate. And it really doesn't make sense, because if you think back to that previous slide, these guys are 0.5 of the population, 1.5 of the population, 98% of the population. So the third estate asks for something called counting by head. That means you're going to count however many people are in the room. So naturally, the third estate would then win every vote because they have more people than the first and second estate, even if they're combined. The reason the third estate wants this so bad is they have a lot of complaints. Number one, they pay the majority of the taxes. They don't even have the majority of the money, but they pay for everything. These people up here who are the bourgeoisie, you can see they're very wealthy. They couldn't get top government positions. So they couldn't become mayors. They couldn't become governors of areas. They couldn't get like top positions in the military. It was all given to the nobility still. And the peasants at the bottom of the third estate were mad about something called the corvée system, which was they had to take time out of their lives to do unpaid labor for the government, like building roads, repairing bridges, going out and getting rid of snow even in the cities. Just basic manual labor, but it was all for free. So at the Estates General, there was deadlock. Nobody could decide what to do. And the third estate finally just decides to leave. So they leave and they go to a nearby indoor tennis court, which you can see in this painting, and they declare themselves the National Assembly. Think of the National Assembly like they're declaring themselves a Congress. And they make an oath called the Tennis Court Oath that says they won't disband until France had a written constitution. And they start discussing and they try to come back to the Estates General, but the king had locked the doors and literally locked them out. So they weren't allowed back in. And this is going to lead to not just them wanting to write a constitution, it's going to lead to obviously a revolution against the king. The French Revolution then begins because of panic, essentially. The people of Paris and the people of France begin to get worried. So there's worries that Louis is going to dissolve the National Assembly. He's going to send in troops and just get rid of it. And also, people start to begin to notice that French soldiers are appearing in the countryside around Paris. So the people of Paris begin to get nervous. They begin to get scared. And that eventually leads to the storming of the Bastille. This is kind of the beginning of the French Revolution. There's a holiday named after it in France. And the reason is it's this giant fortress in the middle of Paris, and it had two things. It was a prison for the king's political prisoners, so it's a symbol of the king of France oppressing the people, and it had weapons and gunpowder in it. Now, when the people stormed the prison, there actually weren't that many political prisoners in it, and it was more of a symbol of the revolution had begun against the king, and the old order was going to be thrown out, and they were going to create this new system of government. So the National Assembly during the Revolution decides to make this document, and they call it the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which you can call the Do-Ro-Mac. Do-Ro-Mac, if you want to. And they come up with this idea of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So citizens will have liberty, they'll all be equal, and there will be brotherhood across the country. It is not a constitution. This is not like the U.S. Constitution. It's more like the Declaration of Independence. It lays out the basic rights of a citizen. So they, instead of using how the United States had life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, they have liberty, property, and security and resistance to oppression. This is just natural rights. You have these rights. They cannot be taken from you. They put in the right to a trial and no illegal imprisonment. Nobody can just throw you in prison without actually having a charge against you. And they want freedom of religion. So it's all those basic natural rights that they say the King of France has broken. He's broken the social contract, and they have a right to overthrow the king. Women played a very important part in the French Revolution, even though they were not included in the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen. So the women, though, their main concern is at this time, bread is super expensive. Remember I talked about that bad harvest? They can't afford bread. So the women of Paris hear a rumor that Marie Antoinette, the Queen of France, is hoarding grain at the Palace of Versailles. Versailles is the king's palace. So they march all the way from Paris to Versailles. They have cannons, rifles, guns, everything that they need for a party. And they surround Versailles and they force the king to return to Paris. This is going to be really important because the king usually stayed outside of Paris. But now, with the king in Paris, he's going to be forced to listen to the people's complaints. Because the king is forced back into Paris by the women and their march to Versailles, the National Assembly can now draft a constitution. Now, it sounds like they're just trying to overthrow the king, but actually, they have to have the king there to sign the constitution to make it legal. So, what the Constitution does is it creates a constitutional monarchy. They're still going to have a king, but there's now going to be a Congress, a legislature that votes on laws, and the king is going to be more like the president of the country. The church, which had a ton of power in France, is put under government control. The land is going to be redistributed. And tax-paying male citizens are now the only ones that can vote within the new country. King Louis agrees, he signs it, and then he tries to escape. And this is going to be what causes the government to go more radical, because he's going to look for allies to try and overthrow the new republic and bring back the monarchy. So now we're going to cover the radical phase of the revolution, where the people get scared, there's a lot of wars, and we're going to see this as a more bloody phase of the French Revolution. So France, now that it is officially a republic with its new constitution, wants to spread the revolution. So a bunch of other monarchies oppose the French Revolution. So you can see France here, and it's going to be surrounded by monarchies. Spain is a monarchy, Great Britain, Austria, there is not really a Netherlands yet. German states, a lot of them are monarchies, Austria-Hungary. So they're all going to want to stop this new idea of democracy from spreading throughout Europe. Somehow, France pulls off the ultimate underdog victory, wins, and begins to establish republics all around it. So in the Constitution of 1793, these guys, the sans-culottes, I told you to know them, it literally means people who long pants. They didn't wear like the high socks that the monarchy wore. They were poor citizens, and they allied with these guys, the Jacobins. And the Jacobins are radical Republicans, which back then meant they wanted to establish a republic. They wanted to totally get rid of the monarchy. So what happens is they pretty much overthrow the government. The National Convention replaces the Legislative Assembly, and they do this. They abolish the monarchy. So France no longer has a monarchy. The king is out. They establish a full republic. Suffrage, every male citizen can vote. You don't have to be tax-paying. You don't have to have land. You can just vote if you're male. They begin to take all of the nobles' lands, and they abolish titles. You actually were supposed to refer to every other person as citizen, male or female. So everybody was just called citizen. But that begins to lead to the reign of terror. See, they're still fighting all these wars. They're worried about people wanting to restore the monarchy. There's different factions within the government. So this guy, Maximilien Robespierre, starts this committee called the Committee of Public Safety. And we're going to find out the Committee of Public Safety is terrible at protecting public safety, because they immediately begin executing anybody who is considered a threat to the revolution or counter-revolutionary. So the first thing they do is they kill the king and queen. They execute them. They cut off their heads. This absolutely terrifies the rest of Europe, because this is the first time a king has really been killed by his people. They go to total war. So total war means that everything a country does is for the war. All citizens are involved, from little kids collecting scrap iron to women making socks in their home to all men are drafted into the army. But eventually what happens is the committee turns on itself, and they begin to say they're not revolutionary enough, and Robespierre is beheaded in 1794, and it kind of ends that reign of terror. So after the Reign of Terror, the Jacobins are thrown out, and France creates its third constitution, the Constitution of 1795. France becomes a liberal republic. Voting is based again on who can pay taxes. Instead of the Committee on Public Safety, there's a 5-man directory. This is going to be like 5 guys being president. We're going to see that works great and doesn't lead to Napoleon at all. That is sarcasm. There's a two-house legislature, just like in the United States, but again, they continue to limit the power of the church. So the major effects of the French Revolution are obviously that France becomes a republic. The monarchy is actually totally eliminated. This isn't like the American Revolution, where a province of Great Britain essentially broke away and started its own country. France completely remade its society. The Enlightenment ideas are used in the French Revolution, just like they were in the American Revolution. Republican government, separation of powers, Bill of Rights was created. But the main difference was the Catholic Church's power was limited. The church was put under government control because it owned so much land, it had so much power. But a major effect was an increase in nationalism. People were proud of being French. You can see from these paintings down here, they're cheering their army on. Look at all the French flags, okay? Look at the colors. It's the colors of France. People begin to be proud of being French, and this spreads. People suddenly start being proud of their ethnicity or their nation, and that's going to cause future wars and future issues. So you can see here the big changes that happened during the French Revolution. This one's a little more detailed. No more monarchy. Roman Catholic Church is curtailed. The feudal system dies in France. There's equality. This is all those new ideas from the Enlightenment. The bourgeoisie pretty much takes control. And nationalism. Nationalism is going to be one of our big changes. So I hope this helps explain the French Revolution. If you have any questions, let me know, and I will be sure to help you.